I mean, I could say, that Henry Cow, for example, this group that I was in, which is really the kind of beginning of my musical involvement, well, not quite the beginning, but almost. So I started in 1968, in this spirit of May 1968, and which was a kind of Marxist spirit. And that group went on until 1978. And that was very much, I would say, a Marxist group, but in a very chaotic way, always full of arguments and so on. The first thing to understand is that I was a communist. So I was kind of living the contradiction of being a communist in the West and learning more about what communism actually was in practice. Because obviously the communism that I read about, it was primarily to begin with a kind of an intellectual attitude. I mean, it simply seemed to me to be something that explained an enormous number of things about my life and the world as I saw it. One of the ways that I started to understand what communism was like in practice was through the recognition of our work by listeners in Eastern Europe. We started to get messages from people saying that they connected to our music and that they were doing music in Eastern Europe. And I think this particularly was true of Prague, of what was then Czechoslovakia. And so I communicated with people in Czechoslovakia. In fact, I wrote in the British Communist Party magazine an article about dissident Czech rock groups, for example. I mean, there's a lot of contradictions going on, yeah? And of course, what you don't realize is that you as a musician are trying to develop self-organization because the existing organizational structures don't suit what you're trying to do. And then you discover that, of course, the problem with the communist countries is even deeper than that, because the Communist Party wants to organize absolutely everything. And the one thing that horrifies it is any kind of independent initiative. Then you feel a kind of solidarity with these musicians. But at the same time, there's this ideological gap, so this is all kind of very interesting stuff. So that's how my sort of first interest in Eastern Europe started. And I went to East Berlin and then on a train to Warsaw. This was at the time of the Solidarność. But again, I mean, on a political level, it was all very ambiguous because I went to an exhibition organized by Solidarność and discovered that it was an anti-abortion exhibition and that Solidarność was a deeply, to my mind, reactionary Roman Catholic organization. So, although I was ready to accept the fact that it was a complete disaster that the Communist Party had completely lost the whole working class of an entire country, that didn't necessarily mean that the alternative was going to be very positive, in my view. '67 was the kind of year of psychedelics, I was actually in India that year. I went to India to try to find the truth, and luckily I didn't find it. Came back and was, smoking a fair amount of hashish, but then sort of things changed for us in '68 because it was almost like the authorities couldn't tolerate this completely autonomous movement. Because, the hippie movement was quite interesting, and I think it's often not not so, perhaps not as valued as it should be, because in a sense, we were making absolutely uncompromising utopian demands. And I think that's quite an interesting thing to do. Whereas when you come into 68, we get sort of drawn into a more Marxist way of thinking, a more normal kind of politics. I wouldn't say that psychedelics was a great influence on Henry Cow's music as it developed, though. I think what we were really interested in was, I think we saw that rock music was extremely open. It had certain qualities. It was extremely open and undefined. So you had this situation where a group like the Beatles, who'd been playing to kind of teeny bopper audiences and wearing their uniforms and sort of playing very simple, basic love songs and so on, started to discover all this stuff, they started to discover musique concrète and Cornelius Cardew, and they were experimenting in studios and making long conceptual albums, and so rock music was very, very undefined. And then the other thing about rock music was that it was group music, which I think also is very interesting, that it really was collectively made. So we saw rock music as a place where we could try to bring in elements from so-called serious contemporary music and put them into this new context so that they would be more accessible for a wider audience. Yeah. So I think rock music is like a kind of a school in that way for me. In fact, I still think of that sometimes when I see, in the context of working with Yanku, because I've noticed that a lot of people who've had a background in rock music find it very easy to work with Yanku, because basically, it's like in rock music there are very, very few behavioral rules, yeah. Whereas in classical, conservatoire, contemporary music, there are lots of behavioral rules. So, for example, I've seen when Yanku used to invite soloists from Paris or London or somewhere to come and play with the Hyperions in Bucharest, some of them would get very upset because it seemed like he wasn't following the rules. But the people who didn't care were people like me and, for example, Daniel Kienzi, for example, who'd been an electric bass player in a rock group. He didn't give a shit about the rules. I seem to remember one gig where he waited at the side of the stage to be called on stage, with his instruments, and he was never called on. He didn't complain, What I've been talking about with Henry Cow, this idea of bringing in, I was very excited by music, Bartók and Stravinsky and Messiaen. It was very big for me. Stockhausen I was still struggling with a little bit, and that generation. But I was trying to bring this stuff and put it on a stage in front of a big audience of young people who didn't know shit, and who would just take it. And also the free improvisation aspect, When it came to punk, what I think the really interesting thing about punk was this adjustment of the means-ends relationship, because what they saw was that there were these kind of groups with an enormous amount of equipment, with an enormous amount of technique, and but with a very hollow, who were very kind of hollow, because inside there was nothing. Whereas if you had something really sort of simple, like, for example, you know, you were very angry about the system and angry about the way you were treated with, you only needed 2 chords on a guitar. But if you really expressed that, that was worth more than a whole album by the Pink Floyd, you know. So that for me, that was very important. I mean, you know, in the abstract, you know these things, but it's also very good to see it actually happening and think, yeah, okay, well, that is really effective, you know. That really does have something to say, this music, you know. And it relates, of course, to ethnic traditions like, you know, Mississippi blues or something like that, you know, when people hardly even had an instrument to play, you know, I mean, but they did this stuff, you know. Well, I always wanted to do contemporary music stuff. I thought, you know, in a way I thought that's what I was doing even, you know, in the 1970s. It was just that I was putting it into a different context. You know, my difficulty started when I just couldn't enter the rule-based contemporary music system. I mean, despite having done the work that I'd done, you know, some of which I think stands up as contemporary music, I was just absolutely persona non grata, you know. I mean, no way was anybody going to commission a piece of music from me or invite me to work with their ensemble or anything like that, you know. It was like I was a criminal, you know. And that changed very, very slowly, but it was a very, very long, hard process, you know, where I felt I really wasn't sure whether it was even worth composing music, you know. So that's why it was very important for me, for example, that Anna Maria and Janku recognized me as someone who could do that, and they weren't part of this same rule-based organization. They had different rules, and their rules were evolved in this huge struggle to even survive in Romania, you know, to physically survive and to not be arrested and to try to get your music played in these incredible circumstances, which really kind of cut through the crap, you know. It was completely different from this adaptive system that we had here, where people were highly institutional, you know. And of course, on the surface, they had this blah blah about individualism and all the rest of it. But in fact, they were all, you know, they were all professors and in fucking university jobs and all this crap, you know, that is contemporary music. I can't remember exactly why, but I realized that I hadn't really got to grips with electroacoustic music. And I asked, I think it was Chris I said, can you lend me some electroacoustic, I want, you know, lend me 15 CDs that are going to turn me onto this stuff. And I went through them all. I found them incredibly bland and boring. And then I found one. I thought, you know, what is this? You know, it was Dumitrescu, Pierre Sacré. So I started asking people about this person, and nobody knew much about him, you know. So I think, I can't remember whether it was with Chris or just me, but we talked with Ed Baxter, who was running the LMC at that time, and he said, okay, the LMC will invite Dumitrescu to London. And so they did, and Janku and Amma with the Hyperion drove from Bucharest to London in 2 cars and did a concert in the Purcell Room. And Resonance, which was the LMC's magazine, said, okay, interview Janku, please, you know, interview them. So I arranged the interview, and I thought it was going to be, you know, a couple of hours, and it ended up being sort of like 8 or 10 hours talking. I don't think they kind of particularly clocked or realized that I was producing music, but our ideas were really, you know, we were really firing off each other. So that's how that all started. it was when Janko started talking about it, and I started trying to get hold of stuff and listen to it, and then I made the connection also with the Romanian folk music, and I also went back and listened to some of the French spectral music, and I kind of understood the different approaches. So yeah, I mean, there is this thing called Romanian spectral music. I don't know what form it is in today exactly, but then, you know, you could ask the same question about French spectral music. I mean, in some ways this spectral music has become an element of contemporary music in general, and I don't know whether there are other composers who are calling themselves spectral composers. Janko's music does get through to people. I mean, all kinds of people, some of whom I would have thought might find it quite off-putting, because it's got a simplicity to it and a kind of honesty to it. And, you know, I see people understanding it and relating to it, all kinds of people, you know. So there's nothing, you know, as Anna Maria and Janko used to sometimes discuss. I mean, the difficulty is in the kind of transmission and diffusion area, because it's so unique what they are doing, you know. On the other hand, that's also an advantage. I mean, another thing that's unique about it is that they actually take recording seriously. I mean, they regard recording as part of the artistic production in a way that almost no other composers do. And that's something I recognized immediately, because I was coming out of rock music, right, where you make albums. I mean, you regard making an album as an important, I mean, you don't anymore, right, but you did in the 70s. And you would mix the album. You know, Henry Cow, we started learning how to use the studio as a musical instrument, you know, by, okay, you record a piece, but then you think, well, hang on, let's just not use the bassoon part in that bit. And then we'll just put some reverb on this instead, and it'll sound much more interesting. So, you know, everything that's recorded is kind of material that you're sculpting towards another result, which will have some effect on the listener, which is like an equivalent to what might have happened at the concert, but in no way a reproduction of it. You know, it's like recording doesn't reproduce anything. It doesn't produce an imitation of the live event. It produces something else. So then you do other things to it. You know, you saturate the sound in a particular way, you add something, you take something away, and then you can get at something which is as exciting in its way as being at a concert, but it's other. You know, it's not a reproduction. And they understood, Janko and Amma understood this, and that's very rare amongst composers, yeah. So the way they had of distributing their CDs everywhere through different channels, which were normally perhaps some channels reserved for noise music or rock music or whatever kind of music, this was in a way a great advantage for them, you know. So what's interesting is that I think they get audiences that other composers would die to have, but at the same time they get no recognition from the rule-based contemporary music system, yeah, which continues to more or less ignore them. just by the mere fact of working with the Hyperion Ensemble, and one is obviously sharing in this extraordinary kind of culture, which because the Hyperion Ensemble is a culture, I think, that Janku and Amma created, and which is kind of passed on to new members. Even with there've been some quite big discontinuities, let's say, where, for example, up to about 2010, the Hyperion Ensemble was mostly Romanian musicians with invited guests from other countries. Then Ilan Volkov invited Janku to Israel, and suddenly it was like there was this other whole group who knew each other already and were able to kind of adapt their culture into being a new kind of Hyperion. We'd had some difficulties, I remember, prior to that, where Janku was bringing in, for example, groups of musicians from New York who really didn't get it, some of them, because they were too much in the head, musicians, So they had more difficulty getting into his music than, some of the original Hyperion members who were like probably not first desk in the orchestra musicians, but they got it, The Israeli contingent was a sort of discontinuity in the history of Hyperion. But what was interesting was that the culture recreated itself, and it managed. Because I think one of the things that was interesting is this business about the social relationships between musicians, and how, in a sense, you have to, if not destroy them, at least push them aside. Yeah, because you need something much more fundamental to be happening, and if people are thinking about each other in that social way, then it's harder. And probably the musicians from the orchestras had a kind of more what you might call a professional way of dealing with that, whereas the group from Tel Aviv were more friends. And so that had to be channeled into being Hyperion. And I think that worked. I think Anna and Janku achieved that, In this London situation, where sometimes throwing in musicians who really don't know what they're going to be dealing with, and so it's a question of, are they going to take to that or not? Some people just can't deal with it. They're sort of horrified by it, And I was trying to say to, sometimes, I try to explain things to people, by saying, well, what are you being asked to do in this situation? What you are being asked to do is to find something within yourself and pull it out on the spur of the moment, right? It's look into yourself and find something extraordinary for that instant in time. That's always the challenge, and you have to keep that in mind, because, after a while, for example, when we were using the scores, it's very easy to recognize something in the score and think, oh yes, that means that. I know how that goes. Blah, blah, blah. That's the, once you start doing that, you're screwed, because that's not, you must use the score as a kind of provocation and a challenge to yourself, So anyway, there's that side of it. So there's the musicians are struggling with Janku, and then Janku, what you're talking about is Janku struggling with the musicians, but that of course is a function, there's an interrelation. So, Janku is in one sense highly pragmatic. I mean, in fact, there couldn't be anybody more pragmatic in the sense that he gets an idea of what's there in terms of human material, and then he'll think, yeah, okay, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do this over here. Actually, I'm not going to use the electronic stuff. Actually, I'm going to start with that instead, or we're going to do that. He has this capacity to, and he wants, in fact, to hold everything in place until it has to be deployed. And for example, I really enjoyed the way at Cafe Otto we had the dark intervals. Yeah. Normally it's very clear. There's an interval, the lights go on, the audience go and get beer, and everybody chatters, and then the lights go off, and then you start the next piece. But at Cafe Otto we were doing dark intervals. This is very nice. It breaks the rules. I mean, Janku found something big a long time ago, and he's been figuring out what it is ever since, but he found it.